Have you ever had the strange feeling that you're becoming the very person you always wish to find deep down? Perhaps without realizing it, every pain you endured, every difficult choice, every prolonged silence was part of something much greater. There is a silent transformation happening within you. A journey almost invisible to the eyes of the world, yet intensely real to your soul. Carl Jung told us that what we most seek out there is often hidden within ourselves. And when that search begins to turn inward, something extraordinary happens. This video is not an explanation. It's a mirror between the woman you were and the one who's about to emerge. But the answer you're looking for isn't where you think it is. There is a thin line between the past that shaped you and the future that calls you. And it's in that intersection between childhood and maturity that our journey begins. Most of who we are is shaped in childhood, but we can only decipher it in maturity. Carl Jung. Do you remember the first time you felt small? Not in the size of your body, but in the vastness of the world. Childhood offers us a landscape of discoveries, but also of absences. A mother's gaze, a father's words, the silences of the home. All of this builds not only memories, but the internal architecture of who we become. It's as if we live inside a mirror, where every adult gesture reflects a part of the child that still lives within us. Many believe that growing up means leaving childhood behind. But growing up in truth means giving voice to the inner woman the child was forced to silence. It means revisiting the hallways of the old house, not with nostalgia, but with a new gaze. The gaze of someone who finally understands why she cried in secret, why she felt insufficient, why she sought love where there was only emptiness. This understanding doesn't come from books, but from the courage to revisit yourself with compassion. And that's the point where self-love stops being a cliche and becomes reconstruction. You cannot love who you are if you despise who you were. The woman who faces the world today needs to reach out her hand to the girl who just wanted to be seen. And this gesture, even if symbolic, changes everything. It's where transformation begins. Not as a miracle, but as a reunion. But there is a detail that changes everything. This reconciliation is only possible when you accept that maturity is not harshness. On the contrary, maturity is softness with awareness. It's the ability to look at the pain of childhood without turning away. It's saying, yes, that happened, but now I am here for you. The strength of the woman you're becoming is born from that mature tenderness. A strength that doesn't shout, but embraces. Imagine a tree. The invisible roots support the trunk everyone sees. So it is with your childhood. Even buried, it supports the woman who walks today. When you ignore those roots, your inner structure trembles. But when you honour your origin, with all its flaws and beauty, then, yes, you grow with truth. Not as a mask, but as essence. What few understand is that this journey is not linear. There are days when you feel strong, and others when the frightened little girl reappears. But this is not regression, it is integration. The complete woman is not the one who says goodbye to the child, but the one who carries her gently in her chest. This does not make you weak, it makes you whole, and wholeness brings something powerful: discernment. You begin to realize that many of your current desires are echoes of what was missing back then. The longing to be heard, to be loved, to be chosen. All of that emerges from the child who waited. When that waiting ends, because you choose yourself, healing begins to happen. Silent, yet transformative. That leads us to something even deeper. Because if childhood shapes who we are, then the way we learn to protect ourselves also reveals the protective woman we've begun to build. All defensive behaviour is the psyche's attempt to protect what is still forming. Carl Jung. Maybe you haven't realized it, but there is a silent force forming within you every time the world hurts you. That force for a long time was just survival, but over time, it begins to take another form. Protection. Not the kind that builds walls, but the kind that creates shelter. Because when pain leaves deep marks, the heart begins to build armor that seems strong, but in reality, only hides fear. The protective woman is not born ready. She is shaped in the intersection between falls and new beginnings. Every time you were silenced, criticized, or ignored, something in you was shut down. But at the same time, something began to observe. The protective woman is this observer. The one who spent so long being wounded that she learned to recognize patterns. She is not cold, she is watchful. But protecting yourself is not about withdrawing from the world. It's about learning to be in it with awareness. When you understand that your childhood taught you to lower your head to avoid conflict, to not be a bother in order to be accepted, the protective woman you're building begins to say, enough. Enough of silencing what you feel. Enough of shrinking yourself to fit in. Enough of repeating a story that was never yours. This is the point where self-love stops being a concept and becomes a decision. You don't protect what you don't value. And when you begin to see yourself with new eyes, a mother's eyes for your own self, you start to treat yourself as someone who deserves protection. Not out of need, but out of awareness. The inner woman who awakens in this process is not a warrior who fights everyone, but a guardian who honors her boundaries. Transformation begins when you understand that the care you longed for from others can be born within you, when you learn to say no without guilt, to walk away without explaining yourself, to remain silent, not as escape, but as wisdom. The woman who rises from these choices is strong, not because she ignores pain, but because she embraces it with compassion. And it's precisely for that reason that you often feel conflicted, because within you still lives the little girl who wanted to please. But now beside her stands a woman who has learned to protect herself, and the two are learning to coexist. There is no mistake in this, there is maturity. The woman you are becoming does not exclude who you once were. She protects her in the way you always needed. But why does it hurt so much, you may ask? Because growing at this level demands inner rupture. You must break with the old belief that you need to disappear to be loved, and that hurts because it's like breaking a mirror that reflected a distorted image of yourself for years. But when that mirror falls, truth emerges. The real image was always stronger than it seemed. And then a new perception is born. The protective woman doesn't live to please. She lives to preserve herself. She chooses with more wisdom, speaks with more presence, feels with more depth. And this new version begins to attract more truthful relationships, safer spaces, deeper connections. Because now who presents herself to the world is not an edited version, but a whole presence. But is this strength you're developing enough? Or is there something even more powerful than protection? Maybe it's what happens when you care for your pain with tenderness and courage. Pain needs to be lived, not denied. What you don't transform, you repeat. Carl Jung. There is a hidden strength in the pain you carry, but it only reveals itself when you stop trying to erase it. Since childhood, we were taught that feeling too much was weakness, that crying was losing control, that being sensitive meant being fragile. And so you learn to silence your inner woman, to hide your anguish, to smile when you wanted to scream. But ignored pain doesn't disappear. It turns into blocks, into anxiety, into relationships that mirror your wounds. True transformation begins when you stop running from the pain and choose to sit with it. What once seemed like a monster reveals itself to be a part of you that just wanted to be heard, like a forgotten child in a dark room, waiting for someone to say, "I see you." And when that listening happens, something shifts. Pain, when cared for, starts to give way to strength. A strength that doesn't come from anger or resistance, but from acceptance. This strength is silent. It doesn't show off. It sustains. It sustains the woman you're becoming. Not as a shield, but as a foundation. And the more you embrace your wounds, the more whole you become. Because there is nothing more powerful than someone who knows their darkness and still chooses to live in light. But it's at this point that many give up. Because caring for your pain requires presence. It requires facing memories you tried to bury. It requires forgiving those who never asked for forgiveness. And even harder, forgiving yourself for having abandoned your own needs for so long. But it's in that very moment, when you look at yourself with compassion for the first time, that healing begins. The inner woman you rejected for fear of vulnerability now becomes your greatest ally. She is the guardian of your sensitivity, your intuition, your emotional depth. And that sensitivity, once repressed, now becomes power. The power to feel, to understand, to transform. Not just yourself, but also the world around you. You begin to realize that your pain had a purpose. It showed you where there was no love, where there was no support, where you needed to rebuild yourself. And from that recognition, self-love stops being something to strive for and becomes a natural path. Because you finally understand that you don't need to fix yourself to be worthy of love. You just need to take care of yourself. And then the strength that rises from well-tended pain becomes visible. Not in shouting, but in serenity. Not in external victories, but in inner peace. You begin to walk more lightly, speak more truthfully, choose with more presence. And each step you take with this new awareness is proof that the transformation has already begun. In the end, pain was just an invitation. A call for you to look at yourself with more honesty. And now that you've answered that call, perhaps the next step is to learn to look at your own story with tenderness. He who looks outside dreams. He who looks inside awakens. Carl Jung. Have you ever wondered how many times you've looked at your own life through the eyes of judgment, instead of understanding? Since childhood, we've been conditioned to measure ourselves by external standards, visible success, successful relationships, accumulated achievements. But we were rarely taught to honour the path we've walked. With all its stumbles, pauses and restarts, honouring your journey is more than remembering the victories. It's recognising how much you survived when no one knew how much it hurt. It's valuing the fact that, even without knowing how, you kept going. The woman you're becoming didn't come from nowhere. She was sculpted day after day by the experiences that shaped you, even the ones you wish you could forget. But there's a detail that changes everything. You can't truly transform while rejecting parts of your own story. The choices you now call mistakes were made with the knowledge and strength you had at that time. And when you look at them with love, parfois, not with guilt, something inside you aligns, as if your inner woman said, "Finally, you understand me." This reconciliation is not a final chapter. It's a doorway. It allows you to access a kind of peace that doesn't depend on external validation, a kind of self-love that doesn't need to prove anything. Because when you honour your path, you free yourself from the burden of needing to be perfect. You begin to allow yourself to be real. And that is revolutionary. It is in this space that transformation blossoms. You stop fighting against yourself. You begin to walk alongside your story instead of against it. And in this more compassionate walk, you discover a new way of seeing life. With lightness, with maturity, with love. Because true maturity happens when you stop waiting for the world to validate you and start validating yourself. And then you begin to understand that every pain, every fall, every failed attempt was an essential step in your awakening process. The woman you are becoming doesn't deny what she's lived, she transforms it. And it's this inner alchemy that makes her so strong. Not because she's never been hurt, but because she's learned to tend to every wound with presence. When you honour your journey, you start to see value where there was once only shame. You begin to speak about yourself with more kindness, to remember with less weight, to give thanks even for the hardest parts. Because you understand that without them, you wouldn't have made it this far. And that is love in its purest form. But is there a place where all this wisdom can finally rest? A space where you no longer have to fight to be accepted, understood, or protected? Maybe that place isn't out there. Maybe it's you, and that's where everything changes. He who looks within awakens, but he who builds within finds home. Carl Jung. There comes a moment when the search ends, not because you found all the answers, but because something inside you finally understands. The place you were always looking for was always within. Becoming your own refuge is an act of profound maturity. It is the transformation of your inner space into shelter, into comfort, into home. And few things are as revolutionary as that. Throughout your life, you were taught to seek safety in others, in relationships, in approval, in external promises. But one day, that inner woman who waited for so long whispers, "Come back home." And this call isn't an escape from the world, it's a return to your essence, a return to a self-love that demands no conditions, no explanations. And this process is subtle. It doesn't begin with big decisions, but with small gestures, respecting your exhaustion, tending to your pain, saying no when necessary. Each of these acts lays down bricks for a safe space within you, a space where there is no judgment, where your childhood is embraced, your pain understood, and the woman you are today is celebrated, just as she is. But what few understand is that this inner refuge isn't meant to isolate you. It's meant to strengthen you. It becomes the foundation from which you relate to the world with more authenticity. When you become your own shelter, you no longer accept crumbs of affection. You no longer trade your truth for acceptance. Because now you carry within yourself what you once desperately sought outside. And in this new territory, transformation settles. You become someone who does not abandon herself, someone who listens to herself, who watches herself with care, who embraces herself in the falls and celebrates herself in the victories, not because life got easier, but because now you are present, whole, and that changes everything. The woman you're becoming no longer needs to prove who she is. She knows, and so she doesn't beg for love, she radiates it. She doesn't plead for space, she creates it. And maybe in this moment you realise that becoming your own refuge was always the real goal, because only then before is it possible to love fully, live deeply, and exist truthfully. And then, wow, everything makes sense. For so long, you believed you had to become someone else, stronger, more lovable, more perfect, in order to finally feel whole. But wasn't it the very woman you've become who was under construction all along? And then, everything makes sense. Every childhood wound, every moment you felt invisible, every attempt to fit into moulds that were never yours. They weren't obstacles. They were maps drawn in pain and silence, all pointing to the same destination. You, the woman you're becoming, is the woman you always needed. She carries the strength that was missing when you were a girl, the courage no one taught you, the embrace you waited for. She didn't come to replace who you were, but to take her hand and say, "Now I will take care of us." In the end, the answer was always there, in the whisper of your intuition, in the discomfort that asked for change, in the loneliness that cried out for presence, in the silent transformation that was happening, even on the days you felt nothing was changing. But are we ready to accept this? Because to accept is to commit. It is to stop running, stop sabotaging, stop waiting for someone else. It is to take responsibility for being your own healing, your own home, your own source of love. And that, Bimom, is terrifying. But it is also liberating, because now you know that you no longer have to desperately search outside for what always existed inside. That you can honour your journey, protect your essence, care for your pain, and be a refuge for yourself. Maybe the answer was within you all along. If you've made it this far, maybe you've already felt that the woman you're becoming is, in fact, the one you've always needed. Not because she has all the answers, but because she's finally learnt to listen to her questions with love. This woman is not defined by her wounds, but by what she did with them. She turned absence into presence, rejection into self-love, and silence into voice. She didn't come to conquer the world. She came to care for her inner world. And when you begin to live like this, with this soft clarity, you realise that transformation was never about changing who you are, but about remembering who you've always been. That's when everything realigns, because now your choices are more conscious, your boundaries clearer, your love deeper. You begin to live not out of reaction, but with intention. Not to prove something to others, but to honour your own essence. And that changes the way you relate, work, breathe. Because when you become a refuge for yourself, nothing else controls you. Not the past, not your fears, not your longing. Now is the moment to take the first step. Start applying these ideas today and then tell me in the comments how the experience was. If you're already on this journey, share your story. What touched you most in this video? What resonated as truth? Your presence here is already a sign that something within you is awakening. Nurture that. Care for the woman who is emerging, because she is your greatest achievement. And if you want to go even deeper on this journey, I'll leave another video right up here that can expand your perspective even more. I'll see you in the next video.